Akiba, thank you for joining us for this really interesting video series we're putting together. I really appreciate your time. But before we dig into a bunch of detailed questions about the future of online learning, I thought I might start off by mentioning that we met many years ago at a company where we had the opportunity to kind of overlap careers and work together. And I've always found you to be a fascinating thinker and strategist in the online arena. But prior to your work in the online education sector, you were a professor and a law professor at Harvard. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your career journey and what drew you to digital teaching and learning.
Thanks, and Whitney, thanks for inviting me. And I should say that in all the interactions we've had when we work together and since, I've always learned more from you than I think I have taught to you. So thank you for the two-way street. I think from the time I was a kid, wanted to be both a professor and a lawyer, and I think the hard part was trying to figure out how to do both. Turns out you can do both. I have degrees in both, advanced degrees in both law and political science, and I've taught both. I taught both over many years, and what I found also was interesting is I love teaching and I love being around students and I love the process. And I know, Whitney, you're a teacher as well. And there's something to be said about being in a classroom with 20 or 100 people, and you can communicate at that level. What I found when I was teaching, before I made the mistake of doing all the things I was told to do, and then they made you an administrator, was if there were 50 students in a class and there were a couple of students in the corners who were on their computers or not paying attention, what I found was I was always, obsessed is the strong word, but it might be the right word, trying to figure out how to get those students sort of drawn into the rest of the class. And I found myself over a series of twists and turns, as we all have in our careers, as Associate Dean for Faculty Development at Harvard Law School. And while I was there, Harvard had, this is the version of the story I tell, it's almost entirely true. Without getting into the details I can't share, Harvard effectively heard that Stanford, in the form of Coursera, was doing something with online learning. What it was, no one quite knew. This was like 2011. And I, in a variety of ways, got involved in that process at Harvard and ended up as the founding vice president for university relations at edX. So giving up sort of my dream job, it's Harvard Law School. It's a pretty good law school. It's not as good as Yale, but it's a good law school. And working with the extraordinary people there was a lot. But what I saw in 2012 was that the walls of the classroom were going to begin to sort of fall away. And the best part of that goes to that obsession I had as a teacher, which was I could draw not only those students hiding in the corners of the classroom but I could also draw in hundreds of thousands, millions of other people who couldn't be in Cambridge or wherever the class was. So we had these great teachers who were teaching people in the best possible way, or at least trying to. And now you could make that available to an almost infinite number of people. And I mean, as the New York Times said, it was the year of the MOOC. It was an intoxicating time to be in online education. Of course, MOOCs have not fulfilled that absurd level of promise that were put on them by people like the New York Times. That said, I think what online learning has done, what edX did, what Coursera did, aside from all of the online learning work that was happening independently well before the year of the MOOC, is it showed that every school, including what most people consider to be the best schools, were willing to sort of put their brand right there online. And I think regardless of whether you think MOOCs had a massive outsized impact, I think the fact that these three of the top, 15 or 20 schools in the world And then all the schools that joined Coursera and all the schools that joined edX were willing to say, we're going to jump into this, regardless of whether it was seen as something that a top school wouldn't do. From that point forward, everyone was involved. So yeah, there's this moment where you think, you get up every morning, you work all day. If you can educate 50 people with that level of energy, or you can educate in a equal or hopefully better way 1,000 people, that, at least at the time, I convinced myself that was a no-brainer. That if I could take the whatever skill or background I had and allow it to scale at that level, that's how I ended up in the online learning space. Since then, I've been trying to figure out how to get it to really scale. And I've worked for a variety of companies where that's been the question. How do you do that? Is it MOOCs? Probably not. Is it synchronous? Probably that's some part of it. Do you change undergrad education? Do you create certificates? Do you do master's degrees? Do you do law degrees? That's the part where I think the world, especially mid to late COVID, is trying to figure that part out.
Yeah, all good points. And it is kind of ironic that on the day that we're filming this, Coursera is IPOing.
10 years ago, I think we all saw that was the most likely outcome. Daphna and Andrew at Coursera, again, it's for profit, always was for profit. edX was always not for profit. I was at the first Coursera Partners Conference, and I was, I think, the only person from edX there. And I gave a talk there basically saying, it's for profit. They're going to have a profit motive eventually. And there was some booing. But I think Coursera has shown that even with a profit motive, even with investors, in this case, thankfully, very patient investors, you can create a massive impact in the world. I think edX, both through its own courses and through Open edX, has also had a huge impact, but it was never going to be a unicorn.
Yeah, and I loved your point about having a greater impact as an educator first, right? That's kind of been part of what has drawn me towards online education as well, right? As you continue to have the opportunity to have a greater impact on more students, to teach to the corners, to your point earlier about your own classroom.
Yeah, the corners of the classroom, the corners of the globe, just leveling the playing field. I think no one in my family had ever gone to an Ivy League school, and I got in just by luck. One of my college professors had gone to Ivy League schools and sort of invited me into the club, but it always seemed so sort of random who had access to this fantastic education, whether it's University of Pittsburgh or University of Pennsylvania or Yale or whatever. Lowering those boundaries, but finding more creative ways to lower them. It's not just, the original attempts, which is like put a camera in the back of a classroom at MIT and let people watch those videos. That's not going to scale. People aren't ready for that. People have to be walked up that ladder of preparation. And I think in the last 10 years, since you and I started working together, I think the ecosystem has been created that allows for all those building blocks to be there. But it took those 10 years. Legal education is very slowly walking up that ladder, but it is.
I am curious what your thoughts are about legal education, which was really late to get into the online game. And I'm hearing about some variances that are coming through the ABA. And so I'm kind of curious where you see the future of law schools.
So legal education is a particular subset. As someone who's worked with the ABA for many years, and I was the point person at Harvard for accreditation. Harvard obviously doesn't have to worry too much about its accreditation, but still had to go through all the same hoops that everyone else did. So legal education in general, so for instance, there were rules against lawyers advertising until very late in the game, right? So the ABA actually had put limits on whether lawyers could advertise at all. So here you have people that are arguably in a business that could not advertise. And it took, years to fight that all the way to the Supreme Court to say that, well, of course lawyers can advertise. That's ridiculous. Why would the ABA say that? So lawyers traditionally have been very traditional. And I think, I'll speak personally now, not obviously for anyone else. I think that was a way to limit access to the legal profession to the same people who were at the same large firms, all white men, right? Women couldn't be lawyers effectively. Jews couldn't practice law, couldn't be hired by traditional law firms. So it was an exclusionary field. African Americans were excluded, and all of them were sort of on the outside trying to get in. And the people who were in the guild were basically saying, "No, you can't come in the guild. You know, we're doors are closed." So that all that to say that law has traditionally tried to close the doors to change, in part because I think companies, individuals put so much faith in lawyers as being effectively, fiduciaries. They have the best interests of their clients in mind. So that's the broader context. I think in the narrow context of online learning, the form of what law schools are promising, let's start with the JD students. What they're promising is not just the transmission of information. So I'll belittle medicine here. I mean, most of what happens in medical schools is you're memorizing stuff. Yes, you're doing stuff, but it's not about cohorts and it's not about teaching each other. It's not about being prepared, right? Yes, you learn a little bit about bedside manner, but in law, you have to transmit the information, but the information is always changing. So what the other thing you're transmitting, the other thing you're teaching is, if you're in front of a judge, how do you react, right? So if a judge who doesn't have to comply with any sort of normal social norms, right? When a judge walks in a courtroom, everyone has to stand up. If a judge starts being rude to you, you can't say, I'm sorry, Your Honor, you're being rude to me. You just have to deal with it. And your client's interests are on, you have to prepare yourself to deal with that. So you have to prepare for that moment of someone being rude to you. How do you respond? In a Socratic class, you're on the hook in a class, and some law professor says, stand up, and they grill you for 20 minutes, and you're shaking and you're upset. That's something that a law school has to prepare you to do, whether it's a senior partner who tells you to do something ridiculous in a short period of time, or a judge. So in defense of why law schools have been slow to do this, so much of what is taught in law schools is not just something you can learn by watching videos. It has to be live. So I think part of the reason it was slow to change is because the synchronous elements of teaching have been slow to develop because bandwidth has been slow to increase. So to really be able to have, like large classes at law schools are 60, 80 people, can you, as a professor, even come close to managing a class that size online the way that you would in person? And the answer until recently has been no. So again, just from a factual basis, I think that's part of why it's been slow to develop, because that interplay has been really slow to come about online. It has been. But you mix that with the sort of traditionalist, where there's a guild here of about a couple hundred schools and really 100 or so really good schools. How do we maintain that brand? How do we maintain that difference? So that, I think, going back to what I said about edX and Coursera, I think we opened the door in part for that. If Harvard and MIT and Berkeley and UT Austin and all these other places and Penn and Princeton and all of those places can do online, why can't law schools do that? It's not going to hurt the brand. So I think that's part of why they were slow. The other thing to consider is what's also been changing with great schools like Northwestern Law School is they've said, well, people who aren't going to practice law, who aren't going to get a JD, can also benefit from learning different elements of law. So I think their Masters of Studies of Law at Northwestern is really the pinnacle of that. It was designed with a very active Northwestern faculty by a great Dean Rodriguez there. It's a fantastic program, and there it teaches. Let's say you're working at a tech company or a biotech company or something like that, and you're looking to understand enough about law to help yourself move forward without always having to go to a general counsel or an outside counsel. They'll give you, either in a short period of time full-time or a longer period of time part-time, the skills that you need to learn. But it was slow to grow to some degree because they didn't have a synchronous solution. They developed that over time. And a lot of schools now, I think, are seeing beyond the JD, master's degrees, executive education programs. They're seeing an opportunity to grow without the need, again, to say, I'm going to spend 3 years full time getting this law degree. There are lots of things that can be learned that you don't have to commit a good chunk of your life to. So I think schools are beginning to do that. And the ABA, to its credit, has been very open about accrediting those sorts of degrees. The JD itself, the 3-year degree, they've been slow, I think, until COVID, and now and just beginning to really change now under enormous pressure in the COVID era. But before, right, they were increasing the number of credits you could get online. So I think it was slow. I think the pace is continuing. I think medical schools were also slow, and the pace is continuing there. And again, in their defense, part of the reason that people want to go to law school and medical school and things like that, and business school, is because there was a cachet, there was a wall around it. And to go back to the beginning of the conversation that we were having, I do fully empathize with the leadership of the ABA, the AMA. That it's their job, it's their responsibility to maintain the value of these degrees that they're accrediting. So there's going to be a difficult interplay between access and making sure that what they're offering still has value. And it's a difficult balance to strike, but I think the ABA is finally in a position where they're willing to make those changes. I've worked at the ABA over many years, and I found them always to be have an open mind, but their default has always been change needs to come after significant analysis of all the potential downfalls, which again I fully understand.
We're working with a number of law schools in the design of Juris Master or LLM programs, and the rules around the JD, to your point earlier, have been like the 1/3 rule, right? So a third of the courses can be online, a third of the content within the face-to-face can be online. And so we've worked within those parameters with our partners to date. But I did just hear there's even a change to the variants where residency requirements were just recently changed, where now you don't necessarily have to come to campus. So if an institution can have a more global footprint, they can have a greater impact and potentially advance learners from across the I don't know, the globe, right? So it's like there's a real interesting time coming for legal education and those institutions that are more forward thinking and ready to go.
I agree. I think the limiting factor, one of the key limiting factors at least, has been the ability to really demonstrate good synchronous learning. I think because every law professor knows, as much as the law professor wants to hear his or her voice the whole time and just like, I know what I'm talking about and I can tell you every case and every nuance. It's important. There's still that transmission of information. But in the absence of interplay, it's not education. The student is not learning what they need to learn. Again, it's a professional school. They're not teaching you a series of facts. They're teaching you how to be a lawyer, how to be a doctor. Those things require nuance. They require at least some degree of interplay. And if it was really, my dog will bark soon too. If you can't do that, and you can't, I hate to say this to my friends at Zoom, but you can't do it on Zoom yet. You can try to do elements of it, but once they've adapted, or some of the other products in the market have had more market share where you really can have, and everyone has better Wi-Fi and all that sort of stuff and better devices, I think they'll recognize if they can see, for instance, I've been involved in accreditation processes before. There's a team that visits, they sit in the back of a class and they observe. So they can't do that on Zoom, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work in online much at all. But once we have those systems in place, maybe by the fall of this coming year, when all the platforms, ours and others, have developed to the point where you can record an entire session. You can really look in the breakout rooms, and you see the ability for one teacher to manage those rooms in the same way that they do in a physical classroom. Walk between the different breakout rooms, see what activities going on there, all those different metrics. Then those visiting teams will say, yeah, that's education. To this point, they haven't been able to see that, so they shouldn't have said yes, because that's not real legal education. But once you have that ability to do that mix of things, and especially when it's a master's and not the JD, I think that those masters are much more, because you're not training someone to be a practicing lawyer. You are primarily transmitting information, giving people some other skills, but that's primarily what you're doing. The ABA has been open-minded about, I think, leaving the doors open for a lot of that. But for the JD, they've been hesitant, and I empathize. But that will change, and there's been a rapid light speed development of all these platforms, including Zoom, to allow for real interchange of ideas, not clumsy, not with the teacher pulling his hair out, but really just allowing the teacher to effectively teach as naturally as she does walking in a banked classroom, in Langdale Hall at Harvard.